But you know what we need to do now, Brian? We need to switch a few gears because there is a brand new book coming out, and it's about the life of Gorilla Monsoon, who the vast amount of our audience knows as the announcer and the namesake of the gorilla position, et cetera, but who not only was an incredible pro wrestler, but at one time was one of the highest paid and most powerful people behind the scenes in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWF, and then as an extension in wrestling in general. And we had an opportunity to get the author of the new book, Irresistible Force, The Life of Gorilla Monsoon, none other than Brian Solomon. He's a member of the Arcadian Vanguard network of correspondents, as well as a great author. He did Blood and Fire with on the Sheik, now Irresistible Force. We had him phone in an interview with me not even 24 hours ago, and we're going to go to that as soon as you tell me that the Wayback Machine is prepped and we can make the seamless transition.
Well, I didn't say anything about seamless. I mean, the Wayback Machine's ready, but let's now go, Jim, through the pleasures and wonders of technology and time to your conversation with Brian Solomon.
All right, folks, on the hotline, we have none other than the author of the brand new book, Irresistible Force. It's the life of Gorilla Monsoon, and the man who covered it and wrote it, as well as being a correspondent in the Arcadian Vanguard universe. And, well, he's connected with a lot of people. It's Brian Solomon, everybody. Brian, thank you for being on the program.
Thanks for having me back, Jim. I'm glad to be here, as always, as you know.
Well, it's good to see you're back, especially after seeing your front. That's an old Jerry Lawler line. I'm sorry, but no, I guess the reason why that I'm especially impressed with the book that you've written is because it hit me not very long into it how overlooked Gorilla Monsoon is in relation to his importance, not only the business. At one time, he was one of the most powerful men in the business behind the scenes, but also the contribution he made to what became the modern day WWF, and how some things may not have been the same without him. And he's overlooked, and this biography sets that straight. But you almost have to introduce the fans to get them into this book as to who Gorilla was and why he was so important, because the home video era came in right at the tail end of his career. So in ring, a lot of people are like, what? They don't realize how great he was. And because he spent almost his entire career in the Northeast in the days of the territories, you read about him, but almost nobody in the rest of the country ever saw him. That to me is why a lot of guys, even in the business today, don't understand what a big deal Gorilla Monsoon was.
Yeah, and that's the reason, one of the main reasons I wanted to do the book, because as we all know, when you think of him today, especially people of a certain age, all we think of is the friendly announcer guy in the frilly tuxedo. And that's great. That's an important part of who he was. And he kind of narrated a lot of our wrestling memories and things, but there's so much more under the surface. And I started to try to understand why there had never been anything done. That was one of the things I thought, how come there's never been a book? There's never been a documentary. I almost feel like even WWE doesn't really, obviously if you watch their documentaries and their shows and their things, you always hear his voice on the narration of all the old clips. But they don't really even do much with him anymore as a historic figure. So I kind of wanted to
as far down the well as they have plumbed, and as much as they have gone into repetition, you would think we'd have got one good hour on Gorilla Monsoon, who was a partner to company for so many years.
And that's the thing. People don't really know that. They don't know that part. Like you mentioned, the wrestling stuff, how there's not a lot of video. And unfortunately, the video that there is of him as a wrestler is really from the later part of his career. And I think that's why sometimes he gets a bad reputation as really being not a great worker or just kind of boring and dull in the ring. And I explain a lot of that in the book, how his best stuff when he was a physical athletic phenomenon, which he was, is really before video. There's not a single Gorilla Monsoon versus Bruno Sammartino match or even a segment of one of their matches that you can watch. So it's like this weird archaeology you have to do. The only way you could see him in his prime is there's some stuff from Japan. Same thing with the Sheik, how they did a much better job preserving their footage over there. You can get a glimpse of it. But I devoted really the first half of this book is all the wrestling years, the years before he was an announcer.
Well, yeah, because again, if people do know the name Gorilla Monsoon in the modern era, the announcer with Bobby Heenan and blah, blah, blah. And, and he was great in that role and was well known by the national television audience, but nobody understands why in a 1980 Madison Square Garden, card, there'll be Gorilla Monsoon in the ring and he's out of shape and he looks, and the people are going ballistic. There, they remembered it had only been 15 years. He was like, in the pantheon of immortals, and you'd be watching in Dallas, Texas, or Kansas City going, what the fuck is happening? But he also didn't push himself down people's throats in terms of nobody wanted to see him up there on the cards. In a lot of cases, he was working on a card where he would be the office representative and they'd put him in a feature match because his name sold tickets. Or they'd put him in the Garden into the 6-man or whatever, or to get a upcoming heel over because he still sold tickets. But you wouldn't understand that unless you were in that territory at the time.
Right. He might be a semi-main event, or like you said, somebody that is getting the heel ready for Backlund or for Bruno, whoever the case may be, or maybe beating them on when they're on their way down, that kind of a thing. But you're right. He had a history there that if you think about it, if you're a fan in the 70s, late 70s, mid 70s, whatever, you definitely remember, or at least people who do, when he was really in his prime. And I talk about in the book how he kind of earned the respect of fans by being such an important figure in the 60s. I mean, he was really the WWE, whatever the company was known as over the years, their first monster heel. I mean, that's a really important, because that company is known for monster heels. And he was the first one. He was the first homegrown, created monster heel. And he went through the whole transformation of, winning the fans over, which was rare in those days. It wasn't something that happened every week on television like it does today, where good guys turn bad, bad guys turn good. It was a very, very big deal. This guy who was an absolute monster turned into one of the most beloved, well-spoken, charismatic figures, of course, with no explanation, because that's wrestling.
It was like a New Jersey version of Fritz von Erich in Dallas. All of a sudden, he's a German, but he's home, and they accept it.
Yeah, they got to the point where they just kind of gave up. They would introduce him as the all-Asiatic champion from Willingboro, New Jersey. That's that for real.
But that's it. Going back even further, you mentioned what an athletic freak he was. He was a legitimate amateur wrestler in school and wrestled at a high level all the way through college. And even though he was big, he was one of those guys that was big and still in shape and still mobile, etc., in the early years. And it didn't take, much time with a guy like that, who also, we would find out, had the intelligence, had the aptitude for the business of wrestling. He gets trained, he gets, the minor pushes in Western New York and etc. But by the time he's Gorilla Monsoon and he's selling all those tickets in all those buildings in the Northeast, he's impressing on Vince Sr., Zacco, Gilzenberg, all those guys that were involved in those days. Hey, this kid is smart, and he's smart to the business, and he's dependable. I've always said the boys can't work themselves into ownership anymore. And Gorilla did it in the same place he really got started, never had to leave, and at one time was one of the highest paid guys in the business.
Yeah, he really won them over. It was a combination of, obviously, he was a great draw in his prime, and he could really work, and he had great matches with everybody. And like you said, he was a great athlete and an NCAA heavyweight finalist. AAU, he was like a standby member of the team, almost made it to the 1960 Olympics. I'm not going to say he was one of the absolute greatest amateur wrestlers to ever turn pro. I don't quite know if I'd put him in that class, but he was very, very good. And it helped that he was huge. And then when he got into wrestling, and like you said, this was a time when a lot of those guys did not have a lot of education. And a lot of them were not very, their main ambition was just where their next meal was going to come from.
They were smart from the carnivals, right, instead of the universities.
They were street smart, and so they looked at somebody like Gorilla and they saw potential there. He had so many things together. He was very imposing physically, so he wasn't somebody anybody was going to mess with. He was very smart about the business. He was well educated. He was well liked. That's important too. He was well liked and respected. And so when I talk about the transition in the book where they start to look at him as somebody who could be a partner and could be part of the office, that's really how it goes. And he's 32 years old when that happens. I'm thinking in my head, yep, 32 years old. And they cut him in for what was at the time 25% ownership.
Well, now hold on. Let's not bury the lead. Explain to the folks who they were. Gorilla's 32. That's in what year?
1969.
Okay, 69. He spent the previous about 5 years or so as the phenomenon that he was in the ring for him at the time, and he's generated him a lot of business. But who are the partners at the time, and exactly how did that go down?
So he came first to Capital Wrestling, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, in the summer of 1963. And basically, he was plugged in as a replacement for Buddy Rogers to be the top heel, the top threat to Bruno, because Rogers had been flaking out and making all these money demands, and he had health issues, and Vince had a lot of buyer's remorse about dealing with him. And so they brought in this kid who was a rookie practically and had a lot of the tools that they wanted. And he was there. He took a brief trip out to California in 65, 66 for about a year just to freshen himself up and came back. But pretty much he was there all through the 60s in the Northeast. And by the time so at that time in the 60s, the Capital Wrestling Corporation is 50% Vince McMahon Sr., Vince and James McMahon, and 50% Toots Mondt. So in 1969, Toots is looking to retire. That's what happened, basically. And he's looking to sell his 50% share. Now, what the original thinking was that they were going to give the other half to Bruno. And that's in the book too, where they wanted to do that whole deal, like where the top star would be, like a Jerry Lawler thing. And Bruno was a little, he held all those guys at arm's length. And he wanted lawyers involved and accountants involved. And they said, no, that's not how we're going to do this. That doesn't work that way. And he said, well, then I'm not going to take the deal. I don't want to be in bed with you guys. He didn't trust them as far as he could throw them, even from the beginning. That whole animosity with him and the McMahon family goes back to the beginning. It wasn't just something that started with Junior. So basically, they were looking around and they decided they were going to split it. So they wound up giving half of Mondt's shares to Phil Zacco, who had been this loyal promoter for them going back to the 50s. He was, a dinosaur even then. Yeah. And they trusted him. He ran a lot of their TVs and things. And he was the front man, basically, because Vince McMahon would not be listed as the owner and all this. So you'd have Gilzenberg, who was never a part owner, by the way, and you'd have Zacco. So they decided they were going to give Zacco half of it and the other half, at Bruno's suggestion, partly, I mean, I think they would have to have agreed with it, was to go to Gino, to Gorilla Monsoon. And that happened in the summer of '69, where they made him this offer. And it happened. I actually got my hands on the paperwork. It's not reprinted in the book, but it's described in the book. And the deal was made on the very same day of the television taping where they turned him babyface.
Well, you can't have these crazy wild men from Manchuria, showing up at the office. But was the amount recorded?
Yes. Yes, it's in there. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I believe they each paid $24,000, something in that range. $24,000.
For 25% each of what would later become the modern day WWE.
Yes. So the company that's now worth like whatever it is, $10 billion, a quarter of that company in 1969 would set you back about 25 grand. And he and Zacco had a deal with Toots Mondt where they were going to send him a monthly check for like 10 years of whatever it came out to, a few $100s a month. And Toots Mondt died in 1976. And my understanding is they continued to send those checks to his widow, to Alma. I think her name is Alma or Alva.
I think Alma. You're right. You something along those lines.
Because he retired and went to St. Louis. One of the reasons, he was getting old, and also his mother-in-law was very sick. I can't imagine. I think he had a very young wife. That's what it was. And his mother-in-law was very sick, and they went back to St. Louis to take care of her, and they continue to get these checks. The ironic thing is that would mean that they wouldn't finish paying it off until 1979, and then it's just 3 years later that they all get bought out by Vince Jr. anyway.
And they're still paying Toots' widow. And by the way, even 25 grand in 1970, even with the inflation calculator, which I don't have in front of me, but I can do some of it in my head at this point, that's barely 100 grand, if that, in today's money.
Right. And I know I'm jumping ahead, but Vince Jr., when he bought it from them, the total was something like 7-point-something million. That's what he paid for the whole thing.
And I think he made his money back. But
oh, yeah.
But that's the thing with Gorilla, and we told the story that he was known for, Gorilla Monsoon, even when he was the WWF president and just, at catering, you go up to him, he would have a roll of bills. He'd have $10,000 in cash on him in his pocket. And you would ask, Gorilla, what do you got? Well, I might need to buy something. He was, at that point in time, when he not only was still a main event wrestler in 1969, but was a 25% owner of the company, over the next 10 years, good Lord, he was one of the highest paid. You can say the promoters made more. Some promoters made more than in their territories than maybe his 25%. But as a wrestler still, he was one of the highest paid wrestlers in the business.
Yeah, he was definitely in the same rarefied air as somebody like a Bruno. I mean, he definitely wasn't making Bruno money as a wrestler, but he was in the six-figure range, as far as I was able to determine. The thing about it, the irony of what he did was when the whole deal happened with Vince Jr., and one of the things I get into in the book is how that was not the most harmonious. It wasn't like some sweet passing of the torch that I think we're sometimes led to believe.
Yeah.
And Gorilla was not in favor of it. And I didn't realize to what degree. And, I talked to his family. I talked to people that were close to him. And the reason he got such a sweetheart deal is because they had to make him happy. Otherwise, he would have fought it. Like, Arnie Skolin, bless him, would have went along with anything they wanted to do.
Yeah.
and Vince getting his dad on his side, it's his dad. So he was able to kind of get him on his side. And Zacko was very, very old and just wanted out. So he really didn't care. Gorilla would have been the obstacle. And they had to do everything in their power to make him happy. But still, it was a bittersweet thing because he was making, let me put it this way, at the height of his earning in his announcer years, he was making the best money of his career. He certainly was because of the deal he had set up. But he knew that he wasn't making anywhere near what he would have been making if he'd been allowed to hold on to his percentage of the ownership.
Yes.
So you had to sort of balance those two things of, well, I'm doing the best that I've ever done, but wow, I could be doing a whole lot better. I mean,
and he didn't have full confidence in, at the early point when all this was first going on, that Vince Jr., Vincent Kennedy McMahon, may necessarily be able to pull this off. It wasn't like he was, a full-throated endorsement. Oh, Vince he's the genius at that point.
Right. And I think people have to remember that because now we have this picture of Vince. Well, I mean, now we have a very different picture of Vince.
Do you have pictures of Vince? If you've got pictures of Vince, call Stephen P. New.
But the image he's created for himself and, the post-1985 Vince or whatever as this mastermind and brilliant promoter and everything, that was not how he was viewed in the business. I mean, when you think about, I'm talking about before that, when you think about promoters' sons, right? I mean, historically in wrestling, they're not that well regarded usually. People like Captain Ed George, right? Who from my last book, or
George
Goulas, right? It's sort of like somebody that you have to just put up with because they're the boss's son, and you got to humor them. And that is also how Vince was viewed. He was not really a success. He had failed at many things before that. He was always coming to his dad and all of them for money. He was struggling. He had very young children. And so it was a very dicey proposition. He also got a sweetheart deal himself because when Vince Sr. was looking to sell, there were other interested parties. And it's pretty much a guarantee that the deal that his son got was a much better deal than anybody else would have gotten.
They just kept running the business, and Vince Jr. paid Vince Sr. out of the money from the gates, and nothing changed.
And they gave him every grace period imaginable. So like when the sale first happened, and this is something I think that gets misunderstood a lot, it was June 1982 when they actually sat down and signed the papers and everything. But the sale itself was not completed for a year. So Vince Jr., and that's why things don't really get moving on that national expansion until late 83, because it took a year for everything to be solidified. They had to make sure that he really had the money. And the thing was, in June of 83, a year later, they still didn't have all of it. And they needed there was like a month's grace period that was built into the deal. And they gave him one more month. And miraculously, somehow, he managed to come up with the rest of it in that month. And he was always, and I will say this, he was very grateful in the end. And it's another reason why I think he was loyal to guys like Gorilla and Arnie because they gave him that leeway. They didn't call in, the loans. They didn't say, well, the deal's up. They actually gave him the benefit of the doubt. And so there was the loyalty there.
There was also an element with Arnold Skolin, with the agents that were there for quite some time. Those specific people, Vince Jr. could say to himself, well, I'm taking care of my dad's guys like he wanted me to, while he had completely put all of his dad's associates out of business across the rest of the country.
Right.
So it's kind of a trade-off for him.
Yeah. And also, I got the sense of this, and this is something that I didn't see talked about a lot, is there really was a lot of doubt and cynicism among all those old timers. All those people that we see as the ones that were the true loyalists, the Blassies, well, certainly Albano. I mean, he blew himself up there, but all those guys, Skolin and Monsoon, they were very, very skeptical of Vince Jr., very skeptical. They still saw him as a kid. And they kind of just went along with things in a lot of ways because they didn't want to rock the boat. But there was always that skepticism there. Like even from talking to his family, you definitely get a sense, I'm talking about Gorilla's family,
Yeah.
that there was a lot of unspoken things, a lot of like, we better keep our mouths shut. We don't want to ruin a good thing here, that kind of a thing. And like, you know, one of the things that's always a standout to me is they all still, especially Gorilla, they all still call him Vinny and Junior and things like that. It's almost like their way of keeping him in his place. And that was one thing I found out about Gorilla was that he insisted, especially privately when they weren't on camera, he always called him Vinny or
Vinny.
Junior or Vinny Junior. They would, I think they did that sort of thing on purpose.
Well, and at the time in the early 80s, you know, Vince Jr. had been the announcer and, you know, he looked good in the suits and et cetera. And he had, as you said, been given a number of opportunities and chances. But Gorilla, through the 70s, in the locker room, behind the scenes, whether he was Booker or whether he was the, what do they call it now? The younger generation, the locker room leader, the Undertaker, the guy that would settle disputes, or I'm not talking about taking somebody to the gym and stretching them, sit guys down, keep order in the locker room, be the leader, be the figure that's respected. They knew he was a part owner, but also if he told you to do something, even if you were a wrestler, he was an intimidating son of a gun in those days, and you did it. And he had been integral because all the rest of the office at that time were, you know, Vince Sr. was not, he was the boss, but he wasn't, you know, imposing in the way that he would come in the locker room and start telling everybody what to do. He had the smoother approach. And then, you know, was Phil Zacco going to come in? Hey, do this and do that. No, Gorilla was the guy that held the company together with the talent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the approach of the father and son, McMahon's, couldn't have been more different. I mean, everything that I have always learned was that he was a very hands-off, kind of broad strokes kind of guy. Like he trusted other people to do their jobs. He would kind of put his head together with Bruno, and they would kind of book the top feuds and things. And Gorilla was involved in that as well. But he really just kind of holed himself up in his office at the Garden and just held court, basically, and trusted other people to do their job. And when you had somebody like Gino in there, you could trust him to do the job. And one of the things that's so interesting is he was so imposing and so and respected. I don't want to just make it sound like people were just terrified of him, that he really was rarely, if ever, actually tested. Like nobody even tried.
Yeah.
You know, one of the only times, in fact, which comes up in the book because it's so rare, was all the stuff with Bruiser Brody.
And I was just going to say, and you can recount the story, but that's so ironic given both guys' connection to Puerto Rico. But go ahead.
That's true. And that is such a strange, it's like one of wrestling's odd coincidences in a way. I don't think there's a connection other than a coincidence, because one of Brody's first big programs, in fact, where he got the name, was in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in the mid-'70s when they were prepping him to be Frank Goodish, to be an opponent for Bruno.
Right.
And of course, they gave him one of their big Irish, everybody had to have an Irish name, especially, I mean, he named Blackjack Mulligan, Hulk Hogan. He just loved the Irish names. And but the thing about it was that Brody, I'm not the first one to say this, could be a very difficult wrestler to deal with. And, you know, he could be not only outside the ring, but even inside the ring. He could be sometimes kind of a bully in the ring and maybe not always do what they wanted him to do. And you know what? He committed the cardinal sin that a wrestler can commit, which is putting your own needs first, right? Because, you know, they always want you to not do that so that you can kind of go with the flow. And Gorilla, as likable as he was and as competent as he was also a company guy. And his attitude towards the business was the opposite. He was very smart about the business, but he thought of it more as, quote unquote, for the good of the business. He was one of those guys who really thought about not just himself, and I really do believe that, but the business itself, and especially the company. And so someone like Brody is kind of like your worst nightmare, a person like that to come in there. And so their relationship was very tense. I tried my best to get to the bottom of it. It's murky. It's murky. I had to go by some people who had firsthand accounts. I talked to Kevin Sullivan about it. He was one of the first people I interviewed because he was there in the locker room in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was the first time that Jose Gonzalez and Brody had wrestled. And when he kind of roughed him up and there was a big fight in the locker room and Gorilla had to get involved to break it up. So I was going by these kind of secondhand accounts and things like that to determine how bad it had been. But I think it's very telling that Brody never came back. They kind of made their money with him and then he never came back. But the Puerto Rico connection is really insane because as some people may know, Gorilla Monsoon owned part of Puerto Rico, the what's now WWC. He owned 10% of it.
And if you can't explain the World Wrestling Council, Carlos Colon, as people they're joined one to the other in most wrestling fans' minds, but it was started in the early 70s, and it was one of the later additions to the territories. And Gorilla, through a few different contacts, had connections and was able to help out pretty much near the start of it, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Because Puerto Rico had, before Carlos Colon, it had sort of been a satellite of Florida a lot of times. So Eddie Graham would run occasionally there. And that is how the Capital WWF people got plugged into it, because they were very close to Eddie Graham. So when the deal was being made of, Eddie Graham is going to kind of give his blessing to Carlos Colon that, Puerto Rico is yours. People like Vince Sr. and Gorilla were involved in all of that because they all moved in the same circles. And so it got onto Gorilla's radar. It's this wonderful place. The weather's beautiful. They have casinos everywhere, which is like, that's like music to his ears. You can go on vacation there and great. And not only that, but he also had a close working relationship with a lot of the Latino wrestlers, even predating that. If you talk to people like Johnny Rods and Pete Sanchez and all those guys, they adored him. So it was like he was a natural liaison. He could bring some of those guys from New York down to Puerto Rico. He could bring some of the Puerto Rico wrestlers up to New York, which he did.
And also he was smart enough to realize, whereas Eddie Graham and the Florida office was running it as a spot show, so maybe guys could go over and spend a couple of days or whatever. A homegrown territory. They'd never done big business. Their big business was in Florida, and that was a spot show for them. But a homegrown territory with native talent on the island with local television was a gold mine.
That's right. Their business was off the charts. I mean, the hunger for wrestling in Puerto Rico was, unlimited. I mean, it was on fire. And that's how Carlos Colon had been basically an enhancement guy in New York. He had not been, and he turned himself into, a major, major deal because that area, that region was starved for big wrestling, and to have its own wrestling organization was huge. It was really the first time in modern times that had happened.
And they're running ballparks, and Gorilla's got 10%.
Yeah. And the way he got it was the original ownership was Colon, Victor Jovica, and Victor Jovica's brother for some reason. And Jovica's brother sold his shares, his 10%, to Gorilla. And the thing about the Brody connection is, a lot of people think, and I dispel this in the book, and I'm not afraid to give this away because there's tons of great stuff in the book, but this whole kind of ridiculous idea that Gorilla, didn't like Brody, and Gorilla owned a part of Puerto Rico, so connect the dots, blah, blah, blah. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. But what happened was the 10% that Gorilla owned he no longer owned at the time that any of that stuff happened with Brody and Jose Gonzalez in Puerto Rico. He had been out of it for years. In fact, he gave his 10%, and I believe he gifted it. I don't even think he sold it. He gave it to Victor Quinones.
Little Victor.
Yes. And Victor Quinones supposedly, allegedly, was in talks to sell that 10% to Brody. And of course, something like that made Jose Gonzalez go through the roof because not now he'd be stuck with this guy who he hated. And now he might even be his boss. So it was all kind of connected in this weird way. But, I get into the book about how Gorilla found out about what had happened down there when Brody was killed, how, Victor called him, and it was this whole thing, and how absolutely devastated he was. And I want to make that clear because it's one thing to not like somebody for professional reasons and to think they're a pain in the ass. It's quite another thing to want them dead. And I think people who make that connection are just being ridiculous. And there's absolutely no factual basis for that at all.
Well, obviously. And that's the, thing is people are always trying to, if they see a coincidence, then they're trying to, tell the backstory. But, and also you give some detail in the book on Gorilla's relationship where you mentioned him, Victor Quinones. And I said a little Victor because that was the way that they were known in the days where there were sort of like I got two Brians on a show, Solomon and Last, in the days where there was a Victor Jovica and a Victor Quinones in the office. Little Victor was to differentiate from Jovica, and he was like a surrogate son for years and years to Gorilla.
He was. And I want to emphasize that word surrogate because if there's no other purpose that this book serves, if I could.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good Lord. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Get that out of the way now.
I want to get it out of the way because I know you read the book. I actually stopped the whole narrative of the book just to address this thing because it is one of the most persistent and stubborn urban legends in the history of wrestling. I've even confronted people who repeat it as fact. And you discover that their basis for that is really nothing. It's just everybody. Okay, so I guess I'll just spell it out.
Yes.
The rumor that Victor Quinones was some type of illegitimate love child or something of Gorilla Monsoon is false. And I debunk it very thoroughly in the book in a lot of different ways. One thing I'll just say,
amazingly enough, with facts.
Hey, imagine, you ever heard of those? Yeah. Well, here's a big one. And I'm not saying this is the be all and end all, but this is really what really got me thinking, okay, this is a lot of nonsense. And I started looking further into it. So there's this assumption, right? When people say, oh, Victor Quinones was actually Gorilla Monsoon's son. So the assumption they're making is that at some point, Gorilla Monsoon was wrestling down in Puerto Rico, right? And he had something happened down there with a fan or God knows what, and he wound up fathering a baby that he didn't know about, or he found out years later. Well, here's the thing. When Victor Quinones was born, Bob Morella was in Ithaca College in upstate New York. Now, I'm not saying that makes it impossible. But in the words of Gorilla himself, it would make it highly unlikely. So, and that's just the beginning. I'm not saying that's the only thing I go on, and even if you go back further, like at the time that he would have had to have been, for you biologists out there, for the time that he would have had to have been down in Puerto Rico, it would have been impossible. I mean, he was doing all his college competitions. He was a student.
He didn't just go on spring break to Puerto Rico and raise havoc, and that wasn't Gorilla. And here's the thing, where a lot of it comes from. In some cases, all of it comes from jealousy over a guy that has pull and power, taking somebody under his wing that everybody else is going, well, it could have been me, or why the fuck's it him, or I just don't like this. There were, in the Tennessee territory in the 80s, there were still guys that would swear, talent, wrestlers on the card that would swear that they knew for a fact, because the old timers told them, that Jerry Jarrett was Roy Welch's son. And that's why he made him the booker. And that's why the blah, blah, blah. Ignoring the fact that at the time Jerry Jarrett was born, Christine Jarrett was married to a guy that later went in the service during World War II, and it didn't even enter the world or realm of wrestling to get a second job until after the war was over with and she had separated from her husband. So there was, again, shit doesn't work, but the guys can't stand it. They would sit, and especially before cell phones and computers and all earbuds and all the fancy Dan entertainment, that was the primary occupation in the locker room, especially amongst the heels, was sit around in a circle and bitch about the office.
Yeah, and it didn't help with the rumor situation when he actually moved in with the Morella family. So that, that added fuel to the fire. But really, I know it's hard to believe, especially in the wrestling business, but Gorilla was just a really nice guy. He was a caring, decent guy. He saw this kid whom he first met in the early 70s or maybe mid 70s when he was a teenager, basically carrying bags, driving them around. His mother ran the hotel where they all stayed at, the Tanama in Puerto Rico. And so he got to know all the wrestlers. He had a very, very bad upbringing. His stepfather had killed himself a few years before. He couldn't read or write. He had no education. And Gino just took him under his wing. For some reason, he saw this kid as somebody that he could shape and mold. There was something in him that he saw. He brought him back to New Jersey with him, and he lived there with them for years. And, I talked to the family about it too. And I was so embarrassed. Can you imagine to even have to bring this up? Because I did bring it up. I said, well, what about these stories and things? And they just kind of all laughed it off. But the thing about it was I think one of the reasons why the rumor persisted, and I wish they had done something about it, is they never saw it as being worthy of even dignifying with a response.
Yeah.
And they never chose to refute it or anything. They just laughed it off. But by doing that, though, I think they made it seem like it was some deep, dark secret, but it really wasn't. In fact, I mean, Victor was prone to exaggeration and telling crazy stories. And I think even he may have at times enjoyed the fact that people wondered if maybe he really was Gino's son. In fact, he had said in an interview with a Puerto Rican wrestling magazine, he claimed once that he wasn't Gorilla's son, but he was his godson. And that he had taken him in the Catholic Church.
Oh, Victor told me that to my face one time. Oh, Gorilla's my godfather.
Well, here's the thing. If he meant it as a term of endearment, if he meant it in like the Marlon Brando sense, maybe, perhaps. But he meant it in the literal sense that in church that he had taken him on as his godfather. And Maureen, God rest her soul, his late wife, who was helping me with the book, she said that even that was not true, that he was not even his godfather. So,
well, see, that's the thing that he got from Gorilla that's why Victor later on became a fairly successful promoter in overseas ventures and things, because he could tell a good story and concoct a fucking backstory to it.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I guess makes you a success in the wrestling business. He never chose to. You know what the other thing is? The New York Times obituary. And I get into that in the book because the obituary in the New York Times actually said Morella is survived by his wife, Maureen, and his 3 children, daughters Sharon, Valerie, and son Victor Quinones of Puerto Rico. So
did Victor call the paper?
We'll never know, but I will say this. We all know that back in the day, now unlike today when the mainstream media is all over professional wrestling, you never really saw obituaries for pro wrestlers. You had to be a really big deal to get mentioned in that way. And when you did, it was full of mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think this was just like one of those games of telephone where just something got mistranslated, miscommunicated, a rumor, an unsubstantiated thing. It got put in the obituary. And when you talk to a lot of people today who believe the legend, they'll always point to that New York Times obituary, which is also false.
Well, speaking of falsified information in the newspaper, Gorilla had the column in what to help me with the Philadelphia paper. What was it? The
Yes,
Inquirer?
the Philadelphia Inquirer. Yeah.
Inquirer, where in the year you're about to tell us, but somewhere in the early 80s, he announced to the people that superstar Billy Graham was dead and never actually retracted it, even after superstar Billy Graham showed back up in front of him. And was it was it a rib at that point where he's like, I'll rib him. People still think he's dead. It's a new Billy Graham. They replaced him.
Right. So it was 1981. And ironically, Superstar would be back in the company wrestling about a year after that. But these things, like I always say, it's partly archaeology because I can't ask either one of those guys about it. But they did, at least Superstar especially, did talk about it in later years. It's a very strange thing that happened. And even Davey O'Hannon told me that a lot of the boys who knew Graham came to Gino and said, well, he seems pretty alive to me. I was just talking to him the other day and things like that. One of the reasons I think he was able to get away with it was that Graham kind of went on this lost weekend period, right? Between in that era, he was hardly wrestling anywhere. I think he had like one match maybe within the span of a year or two. He wasn't doing much of anything.
No, and that's the thing, the state of mind that he was in at that time. You know, if things had gone worse, he might have been dead, but he certainly was out of sight.
So one thing I was able to determine about this, and again, I know I'm giving away all the great secrets of this book, but
no, you couldn't do that. We're only going to be here like an hour. There's no way you could do that. This thing is incredible.
Exactly. Thank you. I stand by the book. There's so much good in it. I don't mind giving away stuff.
Hey, we barely skipped over the 50s and 60s and early 70s, which is the best part of the things because that's what everybody don't know. I learned so much shit. But go ahead, back to the death of Billy Graham.
Yeah. So apparently, the originator of the urban legend may have been Dusty Rhodes, because, and it may have been a rib, actually, indeed a rib, where I think, so Graham had said in an interview in later years that Dusty Rhodes had started the rumor. Now, I looked things up when I was putting this together. Dusty Rhodes, at the time, a few months prior, had gone through one of his trips through the Northeast. And I think it's very conceivable that he might have put his head together with Gorilla Monsoon and thought, hey, this would be a great rib. You should keep it going. Again, I cannot prove that, but the pieces add up. The other piece of the puzzle is, speaking of Brody and difficult people with The Office, Superstar Graham was another one who had, I think, left kind of a bad taste in people's mouths with how everything went down and being a little bit difficult to work with, difficult to get the belt off of, and kind of temperamental. And again, when you think of Gino as part of The Office, even though he always was still one of the boys, but part of The Office, you can understand that, you know, Billy Graham may not have been his number one favorite person on earth. You know what I mean? He might have said, oh yeah, let's get this pain in the ass. You know what I mean? What do you want me to write in my column, Dusty? You got it. All right, let's get this guy. And no, he never retracted it. And it got to the point where when Graham came back as the Kung Fu, Billy Graham, a lot of the fans, particularly in Philadelphia, right, where the thing had run, were convinced that it wasn't the same guy because Gorilla had told them he was dead.
Well, yeah, and he looked like he was at that time. That was the worst thing that anybody ever did to a superstar, was give him that gimmick, and he took it himself.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, you're right. All the great stuff, the stuff from the 60s, I break down in very close detail because one of the things I wanted to do with the book is there's been a million documentaries and books and things and websites that talk about in such detail the WWF of the 80s and 90s and everything that went on and every last day. And even the 70s, you get a lot, you can glean a lot. The 60s is a very murky period. And I really wanted to kind of break it wide open and give the kind of clarity of what was happening in the company in the 60s, the same way they do for the 80s, to really show what was going on, because it's a lot more complicated than people think. Their business was very up and down. It wasn't as hot as I think sometimes people think it is. It got that way later on in the 70s, but they were on very shaky ground in the 60s, especially before they rejoined the NWA. And I wanted to get into that in the book.
And that we've talked on the show here before about a period of time they lost television in New York and didn't have a strong television presence, just on the Spanish language channels. And of course, even through the early 60s, as we've been talking about, Brian Last and I, the other Brian on the program here so often lately, Vince Sr. was even in and out at the Garden itself. He had Capital Wrestling in Washington, but Jack Pfeffer and the old guard was still around. And when Vince Sr. was able to keep Toots Mondt on his side, that kind of turned the tide at the last minute. But it'd been a transformative decade for wrestling in Madison Square Garden to begin with. And Gorilla came in and, at the right place, the right time with the right guy.
Yeah, because it wasn't until about 61 that Vince Sr. was really the only person, with the Johnston brothers and all that stuff, but the only person promoting wrestling at the Garden. There had been kind of like a 3 or 4 year tug of war that was going on where Pfeffer was coming in and Pedro Martinez and even Cola Quariani tried to start some kind of like revolt where, and that's how Bruno got blacklisted because he went to work for him.
Cola had been, and now that you mentioned that, I wonder if Bruno was mad at Vince Sr. all that time for something that Cola Quariani did, but he had been one of the wrestling advisory board to the Johnston brothers, the licensed promoters at Madison Square Garden, since the early 50s, because he'd had a piece of Rocca and Rocca had been the golden goose. And at the Pfeffer files at Notre Dame, I saw from one of the promoters' letters a list of the guys that the Johnstons listened to, and Quariani was at the top of the list.
Well, he'd been around forever. I mean, he'd been around since the 20s, and he tried to start some trouble, and he tried to run opposition. And Bruno, who I think was very young and naive, he had this attitude of, well, I'm a pro wrestler. I'm an independent contractor. I could work for whoever I want. And he always had that attitude because even years later, he told me how Vince Sr. got really mad at him when he kept talking to Ivan Koloff, even after Koloff had joined the IWA with Eddie Einhorn, because that was Bruno's attitude. We can work for whoever we want to work for. And he made the mistake and he crossed Vince and he got blacklisted. And that was part of the reason why. But by the time Gorilla got there in 63, they had really solidified their, at least in New York, their control. But there were times, like you said, where they lost TV. Of all people, it was Crusher Verdue who helped them, sell out the Garden for the first time in years.
I know when I did an interview, a video with Bruno back over 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever. We were going over his record at the Garden and everything. I said, "You sold out with Crusher Verdue, Crusher Verdue." I couldn't even get Bruno to say anything bad about Crusher Verdue, but he was like, "Well, yes, he was good,
I think I chalk that more up to Albano because Albano was Albano's first guy. And I think Albano was just so damn good at generating heat and getting people pissed off and angry. I think it was more, it could have been nothing against Crusher Verdue. I think it could have been anybody. It helped that he was a big giant guy that really looked unstoppable. But that was one of the periods where they lost their TV and before that. And the Garden went dark. There were months where they just didn't even book any shows at the Garden. And this was during the time when they used to run monthly and they were taking time off, or there was one show where they drew something like 5,000 people, which was disastrous in those days. And so it wasn't this easy road that people remember. And I think that's partly why they were so loyal to Gino, because he had really proved himself. He had 7 main events. And this is the tragedy. We can't see any of this. He had 7 main events with Bruno Sammartino at the Garden alone. He had more than that, I think, in Philadelphia. I mean, they had big matches. They had their famous 70-minute curfew draw. They had the one at Roosevelt Stadium. I mean, he really proved himself, and they never forgot that.
Well, and apparently they forgot to film all those matches. And in the 60s, I wonder, well, you've been up there, Solomon Grundy. You've been up there. To what extent, and this was probably, you were there before they stuck everything in the mountain. To what extent does even their library contain anything from the 60s, from this formative period up in the WWE now?
Well, I can only speak of the time that I was there, and I could also go by what I've seen since. And I know when I was there and I was able to even go physically into the room and look through everything myself, I saw nothing that predated the early 70s. And I'm telling you, I was looking, unless it's mislabeled, the early 70s was as far back as I saw. Now, I know over the years, a few things have surfaced, like there was the Bobby Davis tape. I think I had told you about it, where Bobby Davis had made a kind of a highlight reel of all his best stuff.
Yeah.
And it contained some 60s Capitol. There's a couple of, and by a couple, I mean like literally 2 episodes of Capitol Wrestling from the 60s that are floating around, a handful of garden matches. But you can't, there's nothing. There is, if it exists, I would be happy to see it and retract this.
Yes.
But there isn't a single minute of footage of Gorilla Monsoon as a heel in the WWF. Not a single minute of it.
Well, and you retweeted or tweeted or sent out the clip from his Japan tour in the 60s, and it just him, he was the guy that would jump up and do the high splash, jump up and touch his toes. He takes the bump over the top rope like the old time giants used to take that bump. The last guy I saw it do it like that was the One Man Gang when he was Crusher Broomfield. But he was so agile and just so impressive looking. It's a shame, that we have none of that left.
He would do cartwheels. Okay. Picture that. Put that in your head. And the move you're talking about where he did that midair split, for just to be clear, like that's the thing that Rocca used to do. And there's pictures of him where he does a split in midair and his feet touch his hands.
Yeah. Rocca didn't weigh 325 or 330,
Right. Forget that. He was doing it maybe closer to 375, 380 and 6'6". I mean, it's an incredible sight. There is some stuff of that era, but it's Japan. In fact, he was on a tour in Japan at the beginning of 1963 when he first got the call to come to Capitol. And there is some footage of that tour out there where he's teaming with Killer Kowalski and he's wrestling Ricky Dozan. And actually, it was Kowalski who helped to make the introduction because Kowalski really got to like him in Japan. They became good friends. And that's also why he was, they were always close. But Kowalski had the connection with Vince because he'd been working for Vince going back to the 50s. So he was able to kind of make that introduction. And then the rest was history. By the summer, he was already the biggest heel they had.
Well, I tell you what, we told him at the start, but we're going to tell him again. The title of the book is Irresistible Force, and the author of the book is Brian Solomon. And Brian, how in the world can people rush to their various devices and order this thing, and when does it come out?
Okay, well, the first thing is for everyone that's asked, it will be available in print, in digital, and in audio. I'm currently recording the audiobook version, so that may take a little bit later to come out.
Oh, good Lord. Yeah, that'll take a couple of years. This thing is thick.
I know. It's kind of torture. I've been doing it for days and I'm not even halfway through, and I don't even know how I still have a voice. But the book, the print and the ebook versions, the official publication date is September 30th. You can pre-order it now, absolutely. And you can get it wherever you get books. You can get it on Amazon. That's probably where most people will get it. You can get it at Barnes & Noble, either the store or barnesandnoble.com. There's Books A Million, all the major book chains, or you could even just your local bookstore. And if they don't have it, or they don't plan on getting it, just ask them to order it because it's really going to be available everywhere. You could even go to ECW Press directly and order it there, especially if you're in Canada. That might be the way to go, because it'll be domestic instead of ordering it in Canada from the United States.
It's dodgy going across the borders these days. And here's something. Why don't some enterprising person just go to every bookstore in town and tell them to order the book? And then you don't have to come back and buy it, but at least, Brian, you'll sell a lot of books. Maybe you could do that plan.
Why not? Why not? With the Chic book, Blood and Fire, I kept pushing the pre-order so hard that Amazon ran out of copies before the on sale date. And then everyone wanted to kill me. So,
well, no, but now see that they need to be prepared that you are a best-selling author.
Well, I hope they do better this time. We'll see.
All right. But everybody knows how to get it now and when to get it and where to get it. And I will say they should get it because, again, there's not a lot of wrestling books that I learn stuff from these days, unfortunately. But yours are always one of them or two of them or however many the fuck you've done. However many there been, I've learned something from them.
Thank you,
Brian Solomon, Irresistible Force, Gorilla Monsoon. Go out and buy it.
All right, we are back. We are here in the present.
Sounds like we're in the little wedding chapel in Las Vegas. I wonder, are we married to Solomon now?
I got to give him a lot of credit, the research he did. And, there's still so many things you can't find out because there are so many secrets that guys literally went to their death with. And he did as good as he could. I think he did a better job maybe than anyone, very briefly, kind of quickly, but laying out how Vince McMahon Sr. really came to power. And really it was about all the local promoters around him getting behind him.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of names, for people that have always been looking to close the gap on, how did Ray Fabiani move from, wrestling to just opera? And how did Abe Ford get put in place in Boston? A lot of that's kind of laid out here in the story, because the story of Gorilla Monsoon is the story of the WWF in a lot of ways.
Well, and I guess we should have also made the point when I was talking to Brian that the 60s as a formative period for the WWF, they didn't have Boston till later on in the 60s. They still had to make a deal at the first part of the decade for Baltimore. And then they got Philadelphia and the Garden, obviously, but the territory was still expanding into what even the modern 70s fans would know as that era of WWF. So Gorilla was instrumental in a lot of those acquisitions and being able to expand the territory.
Yeah, a fascinating book. Again, it is Irresistible Force by Brian R. Solomon. Go to Amazon. We'll have a link we'll put up also when the show goes up. But check it out. Definitely well worth your time. One of the better wrestling biographies out there.
And as he mentioned, he's recording the audiobook. And folks, just think, coming up sometime soon, you could have Brian Solomon's dulcet tones in your head for literally dozens of hours straight. Only if you're tied to a chair, but folks, they could be on your Raycon everyday earbuds. And that way you would not even have to deviate or be a deviant from your daily routine. You could do two things at the same time. Listen to Brian Solomon excite you with tales of Gorilla Monsoon and go about taking a shit or making coleslaw. It's completely up to you. Brian, how many things can you do at the same time?
This is a hell of a spot so far. Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
While you are wearing the latest version of Raycon's Everyday Earbuds Classic. They brought them back. It's like the Model T upgraded and improved all over again. Now featuring active noise cancellation. Well, how many things can you do while you're listening to your earbuds?
Oh, just about anything. Almost anything. Not quite everything, but almost there.
Almost there. And well, sometimes it can get you over the hump there.
That's what you need.
It depends on what you're listening to.
And then you just roll downhill.
And just roll with the changes. Folks, you can pair the idea of the active noise cancellation in the new version of the Everyday Earbuds Classic with 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life. Your Raycons never have to leave your ears. And as a matter of fact, once you're gone, they'll have to pry them from your cold, dead ears. Nobody's allowed to take away my Raycons. And their audio quality rivals all the big audio brands that you know and love at half the price. So you can literally buy twice the amount of Raycon Everyday Earbuds Classic that you for the same price as these big hoity-toity brands. And that means you can not only listen to them, but you can give them to a loved one or a friend or family member. We've suggested in the past the neighbors. And that way, if you activate the special eavesdrop button while your neighbor is listening to his Everyday Earbuds, you can hear what's going on in his house.
There is no eavesdrop
And it's really fun on Friday nights around sexy time.
Let's all keep to ourselves unless invited in. But of course, you can invite the sounds of wonderful sounds into your ear with Raycon.
Yeah, yes, you can. You can do that. What makes them a must-have? I'll tell you what. Because they're iconic, and you can listen to anything you want to listen to and groove to the sounds and move to the groove. And it would behoove you to move to your groove. And right now, before any more occurs, go to Buy Raycon. That's BUYRAYCON.com/JCE. 20% off the fan favorite Everyday Earbuds Classic. I don't know why we even have to say this site anymore. We've been telling you for years now, and everybody seems to be happy with it so far. It's buyraycon.com/JCE. 20% off the classics. And often you don't get to buy a classic at any price, especially a discount. I'm telling you, it's the Model T of earbuds. Come on. You know it, especially just when you press the button and it has the old horn honk.
You can stop
Ooga, ooga. That moves people out of your way on the streets.
Oh, you hear that old sound, Jim? And of course, that sound connotates it's time to let people know in a very serious way because we care about their ear and their ear health.
Yes.
The finest sounds with Raycon, a great deal for the listeners.
Just straight right down the middle. No, 20% off the classics at buyraycon. Buyraycon.com/JCE. Oh, God. Oh, God.